Well, good evening to you all and to another Durham Castle Lecture. I wish I could say this was the 50th, and it would have been very appropriate, but it's the 49th in our series. It's a special pleasure, of course, for me this evening to introduce Stuart Corbridge, to give this Durham Castle Lecture on the theme set out here, the search for order, understanding Hindu-Muslim violence in the post-partition India. I've known Stuart a very long time, over 30 years, I guess, since I was a postdoc in Cambridge, and so were you. And we've collided in our careers, not quite collided, but met from time to time over the course of those 30 years. And I am absolutely delighted that Stuart is now the Vice-Chancellor of this university. He was born in 1957 and grew up in the West Midlands. He studied geography at Sydney, Sussex, Cambridge, and graduated in 1978 with a first-class honours degree, and then continued to do his PhD in Cambridge and focused on the politics of ethno-regionalism, if I can pronounce this correctly, in Jharkhand, India. He has carried out fieldwork in eastern India ever since, and he's worked extensively in that region for the UK's Department of International Development, including working on public service delivery issues, joint forest management, participation, and empowerment. Prior to his appointment here, of course, Stuart served as Pro-Director for Research and External Relations at the LSE, and in September 2013, he was appointed as the first Deputy Director and Provost of the London School of Economics, and of course, he's here now. I won't mention many of his books, but just let me mention a few. He's co-authored a number of really important books on India: Reinventing India 2000, Seeing the State, Governments and Governmentality in India 2005, and India Today, Economy, Politics and Society. Glad to see the late newcomers filling out your audience, Stuart. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. I think the word is intersected in terms of our careers, David. So it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be with you tonight. The slight disadvantage is that we've had a 4 or 5 course meal beforehand upstairs, and it's slightly unusual to be talking after that. But nonetheless, I will speak for about 50 minutes and try and elaborate both parts of the proposition. One is a general set of propositions about social science, and the other is specifically about Hindu-Muslim violence in post-partition India. What I thought I would do, David was kind enough to mention a couple of books, but de facto I've been a university bureaucrat for the last 9 years, and I haven't done serious field work in India since about 2001, and I've lived vicariously really through co-authors and PhD students. But I did set myself the goal when becoming Vice-Chancellor of giving 3 public talks and trying to marry a couple of topics through a research interest on each occasion. So I gave a talk last term about the first person of African descent to win a Nobel Prize in economics, which was W. Arthur Lewis, and I used that to talk about diversity, particularly the lack of diversity of the faculty in the UK and the absence particularly of black faculty members. I will try, although I do so with some trepidation now, later at Hatfield next term and down at Queen's, to talk about difficulty. And I say with some trepidation because I want to enter the debate that Stefan Collini has mainly made his own, and David has told me that Collini is going to be speaking here in this series later in the year, but trying to reflect on why we have universities and what the fundamental purposes of universities might be. But for this middle lecture, I wanted to pick up a third alliterative D, which is around difference, and to try and reflect a little bit on where we position the social sciences within the academy, what's going on in the social sciences in a very general sense, and then to link that up, I hope fairly seamlessly, to a particular debate about the origins and causes of Hindu-Muslim violence in post-partition India. So you will all know, of course, the famous intervention of C.P. Snow around the two cultures, the arts and the sciences. I'm sort of taking my leave, and this is the only book that I'm going to hold up this evening, from Jerome Kagan, who is a very eminent social scientist at Harvard, who's talking about the three cultures, the arts and humanities, the natural sciences, and the social sciences. I think it's a very interesting time to be a social scientist, and David and I have both come fairly recently from the LSE, which is, in a sense, one of the epicenters of the social sciences, certainly in the UK. Now, if you are, like myself, a geographer by training and were trained in the 1970s, you essentially took half a natural science degree and were trained quantitatively. In fact, geographers in the 1970s were trained to a higher mathematical standard than economists. Now, that certainly is not the case today. Geography is fundamentally, human geography, moved along with subjects like anthropology to embrace post-structural forms of reasoning, having gone through quite a long Marxist and post-Marxist phase. And that's put it out of step fundamentally with what I take to be the emerging mainstream in social science. And that mainstream has, particularly in North America, it's fair to say, particularly in the United States, become increasingly fastened around a more quantitative understanding of certain events and processes in the social world. So there's a growing regard for formal model building and hypothesis testing. It's not just in economics, but it's very strongly the case when you add the capital S word in political science and in some parts of sociology too. A real sense that you address an intellectual puzzle which might be linked to public policy, and a real sense of excitement in the seminars that grow up around these topics. It's the quasi-scientization of the social sciences. Partly, I think this is driven by the fact that we are now creating in the social sciences very large, publicly available data sets. I mention here the data sets, for example, available to political scientists from Freedom House, the Polity Project, Transparency International, Kaufman Cray, and many others. And I'm going to pick up on one of those data sets later on tonight. But if you are a social scientist now, trained at somewhere like Oxford or Essex or the LSE in particular, in economics and political science, there is a huge emphasis upon methodological training. Much greater interest in statistical techniques, much greater attention to dealing with issues around endogeneity or reverse causation, and in particular the use of instrumental variables to try and sort out what is cause and what is effect. And at the same time, and I think particularly in economics, but we're seeing it now much more in political science, an attention to meso-level work based not so much on natural experiments, but particularly on randomized experiments. And this is coming into the social scientific literature, particularly on South Asia. And I'll pick up a couple of examples later on. And what I want to do tonight is engage with this account of what's happening in the social sciences and to test it out against one particular set of literature on communal violence, particularly violence between Hindus and Muslims in post-partition India. Now, I'm just going to give a couple of examples of what I mean to start with, just to set the scene. Economics is, in many ways, and certainly I think it's fair to say, David, that our colleagues at LSE would see themselves as the kings and queens of the social sciences, possibly taking as their model not so much history or biology, but physics, and constituting themselves as the leading edge of social science, and particularly using fairly simple techniques, in this case cross-country regressions, to try and address some big public policy issues. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why the public has got engaged with social science through books like, for example, Freakonomics. In this case, I've simply put up a very well-known slide, you'll see it in a moment, from a famous paper by Dollar and Cray, two American economists, which has the provocative title, "Growth is Good for the Poor." And the main statement in this article, on the basis of cross-country regressions, is that average incomes of the poorest quintile rise proportionately with average incomes in 92 countries spanning the last 4 decades. This is because the share of income of the poorest quintile does not vary systematically with average incomes. Now, this is a classic proposition in economics. It's based on very simple cross-country regressions. So you're essentially got a regression line here, which is a fairly stable line between the lowest quintile and the median income, and you get a fairly stable plot, as you can see. And the proposition that emerges from this is that there is no reason to assume that poor people have to consume the crumbs from a rich person's table. This, in other words, is an attempt to disprove the idea of trickle-down economics. The fundamental proposition here is that if the incomes of the bottom quintile are rising proportionately with those of the median income, it's more like a wave that breaks over the economy, equally washing all parts of society in equal measure. Now, I mean, this has led to a very profound debate in economics, people like Thomas Piketty and others coming in, pointing out that if you regressed it against the share of the top 10% of the income distribution in this country or the United States or India, you would get a very different distribution indeed. In the case of Dollar and Cray, they argue that there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that we need specifically pro-poor policies to deal with the problems of poorer people. Rather, you energize economic growth per se on the assumption that it washes evenly over the population. So no particular advocacy here for policies which boost public spending on health or education, formal democratic institutions, or labour productivity in agriculture. They maintain, while it's likely that these factors are important in bettering the lot of poor people in some countries and under some circumstances, we are unable to uncover any evidence that they systematically raise the share of income of the poorest in our large cross-country sample. In their view, therefore, what you need is the standard package of macroeconomic policies, a basic package of private property rights, fiscal discipline, macroeconomic stability, and openness to trade, on average increases the income of the poor to the same extent that it increases the income of other households in society. Now, this is a particularly controversial example, but the reason why I give it is that it's based on very simple cross-country regression analysis with a large N, multiple countries over 4 decades, and it's ignited a continuing research project or paradigm among social scientists. And in that specific sense, I think we're seeing quite important and exciting developments in the social sciences at the moment as people engage one another over fairly standardized databases. We can move it on a little bit and see how this is mapping out in other areas too. A lot of economists are now beginning to ask, why do we get civil wars in Africa? Why do we get the rise of Naxalism or Maoist movements in eastern India? There's a very famous couple of economists that you can see here, Ray Fisman and Ted Miguel, based at Columbia and Berkeley, in a book called Economic Gangsters, clearly intended for the general mass audience, where they say rainfall is key for understanding Africa's recent history of violence. And I've italicized the next bit. More wars break out when the rains fail. And a lot of statistical work has gone into establishing or seeking to establish that proposition. While we can't control the weather, they say, knowing that it's at the root of civil conflict may help us to figure out how to finally end Africa's perfect storm of violence and poverty. So we're seeing social scientists using very large data sets, quite sophisticated statistical techniques, to try and isolate the independent variable and build a generalized model in social science with public policy implications. Here, the independent variable becomes rainfall, the dependent variable is civil wars, and the possibility of intervention is clearly going to be around mitigation of climatic events. At another level, and I think this excites a large number of us that have worked in South Asia particularly, and more generally, I think, students, one can think of the work of the MIT Poverty Action Lab, and particularly the work of Abhijit Banerjee and his wife Esther Duflo and their colleagues. They've addressed a particularly important problem in most parts of rural India, which is, when I was working there 15 or 16 years ago in Bihar, Jharkhand, even in West Bengal, you could turn up in a village on any given day and the chance of seeing a school teacher, even though he, and it was almost always a he, was paid to be there, the chance of that person being at work was perhaps 40, 45%. This doesn't show up terribly well, but you've got states on the left from Maharashtra through to the area where I've worked on the right, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Bihar. This is showing the percentage of teachers actually engaged in classroom activity by state. And you can see over on the right-hand side that at any one time you've got maybe 30, 35% of teachers actually turning up to educate the kids. They're claiming the salary, they're protected by very strong teachers' trade unions at this time, particularly in rural areas. There's very little choice in terms of private education. So what do you do about it? One of the interesting things about social science, particularly through the MIT Poverty Action Lab, is let's approach this as a quasi-medical experiment. So a very famous experiment was done by Banerjee and Duflo, working with NGOs in India, which fundamentally worked on the proposition that if you take an area, say, of about 600 villages, where you can hold ecology constant, the basic ethnic and caste composition constant, and divide it into, say, 6 equal, wouldn't be quadrants, but whatever a sixth is. Do nothing in one area, that will be your placebo, and then have a series of interventions in 5 other areas. You collect your baseline information at year 0, and then you evaluate each of the interventions over a period of 3 to 5 years. And this was a very, very famous study that was done by the MIT Poverty Action Lab on precisely that basis. So if you look at the second column from the left, one bright idea they came up with was giving parents on the local village education committee a digital camera. This was about 10 years ago. So they could actually take a picture of the school teacher if the school teacher was present in the village. What would be the effect of doing that? On the left-hand side, there was a program where basically you got the most educated youth in the village, and you paid that person a small amount of woman, whether it was a young woman or a young man, to teach the kids in that selection of 100 villages. You can have computer-assisted learning, quite difficult in some parts of rural India, an additional year of schooling at grade 3, an additional year of schooling at grade 4, reduce the class size from 50 to 30. But because you can assume that you've got constant conditions across the 6 quadrants, and you can collect very good baseline data, then you can assess which of these interventions is the most effective. And you can see very clearly that the cost effectiveness in terms of gains in math and verbal reasoning scores on the vertical axis are very clearly from the Balshaki program. That is then a finding that you can take to government and scale up. And this is one of the main ways that social science is becoming interesting. We see it in healthcare interventions in the UK in the same way that we see it with education in India. Statistical training is strong, the emphasis upon a formal model to test, and the emphasis upon, in this case, a randomized experiment. One can do the same thing about, for example, does it make any difference if your local representative on a panchayat in India is a female? The answer, it turns out, is a hell of a lot of difference, actually, and we can now prove it quite clearly. Now, there are many other rules that are being developed in social science, but social science obviously deals with open systems. We have very difficult issues of what is cause and what is effect, huge endogeneity problems. But as a general proposition, you would expect that countries with very high levels of ethnic fractionalization will find it difficult to stay together. It's a reasonable proposition. Generally speaking, around the world, if you're rich, urban, and a man, you're more likely to vote than if you're poor, rural, and female. Generally speaking, it's very hard to sustain democratic forms of rule at average per capita income levels of less than $8,000. And here I'm talking about 2005 prices in terms of purchasing power parities. We are beginning to generate then in social science quasi-rules. It's not quite E equals MC squared, but they are basic propositions in social science until you get to India. And India, for me, is fascinating because it defeats almost all of these rules. India is the great exception to the regression line. It's the residual generally away from it, and a huge residual, of course, when you're talking about more than 1 billion people. You might recall Winston Churchill once said, "India is no more a country than is the equator." If you go back and read articles in the British press in late 1947, 1948, you will find that very few members of the British establishment expected that India would survive the passing of colonial rule. But India is still with us. It's maintained its territorial borders more or less intact since 1947, despite having incredible levels of ethnic fractionalization. Just look at an Indian currency note with the 16 languages plus English. It's the one country in the world where in local elections and national elections and state elections, poor rural women are more likely to vote than rich urban men. It has sustained a democracy, a very vibrant democracy. Amartya Sen refers to the argumentative Indian since 1947, with the awful exception of the 18 months of the emergency from 1975 to 1977, when Indira Gandhi suspended democratic rule in India. And even more astonishingly, there is absolutely no evidence that corruption is declining in India today, that institutional quality is improving, and yet this is a country that's had more than 30 years of sustained economic growth, which economists tell us shouldn't happen. So India fascinates me because I'm drawn to the idea that we can generate rules in social science, but my training as an Indianist makes me highly skeptical of that proposition. And I was very struck by a friend of mine who teaches at NYU, who's one of the best development economists in the world, Bill Easterly, who is committed to the idea of a quantitative social science. Even Bill said in the New York Review of Books, humans are suckers for finding patterns where none really exist, like seeing the shapes of lions and giraffes in the cloud. And I want to take up that idea now about, are we really seeing clear linear patterns, such as are represented in regression lines, or are we thinking that we're seeing stability and continuity, when in fact there's much higher levels of difference? Whoops. This thing is quite hot on the trigger. So the opposite approach in social science, of course, is the one that you're likely to find in anthropology. I mention here Henrietta Moore. I must now call her Dame Henrietta Moore, who's actually a student of Trevelyan College and now teaches at UCL. She wrote a very famous book called A Passion for Difference. Anthropology, famously, of course, is based on immersion in one field site, occasionally more than one field site, really understanding people from their own point of view. Deep immersion, language work, N equals 1, but understanding the meanings of how people interpret the world in which they live. The way that an anthropologist understands social science, it seems to me, is a bit like dropping a stone into a pond, which ripples out. So the fundamental logic is synecdochal. So you're hoping that the village that you work in over time tells you stories about the wider pond in this case. There are very famous books in anthropology where you can learn a lot about a whole country from one carefully chosen, deeply studied village case study. My favorite happens to be a piece of work in Lesotho by a guy called James Ferguson at Stanford, which is an account of the anti-politics machine. Now, let me turn to Hindu-Muslim violence and the main part of the talk. Although I've indicated that on the one hand, social science, mainstream social science, in my view, is moving towards formal model building, hypothesis testing, very strong training in advanced statistical techniques to deal with endogeneity issues. I've also indicated that India seems not to fit that general view of the world. India seems always to be exceptional. However, there is one area in India where social science has developed a very interesting account of something that matters deeply to the lives of people that live in South Asia, and that is the phenomenon of intercommunity violence, rioting. And when I say intercommunity, whilst there are examples of attacks on Sikhs, notably in Delhi in 1984, after the assassination of Indira Gandhi, we're mainly going to be talking about violence between the two main communities in India, the dominant Hindu community and the minority Muslim community. What has happened over the last 20 years is that the question of why we have Hindu-Muslim violence, and occasionally violence against other minorities, where it happens and when it happens, has been the subject of a prolonged piece of social scientific work. In this case, the work has been led by two key figures. One is Ashutosh Varshney, who now teaches at Brown University, is a regular correspondent for the Indian Express newspaper. And the other is Stephen Wilkinson, who currently teaches at Yale University. What's astonishing about this in the first case is that they built a common database when they were PhD students in the 1990s. And the database that they've used is essentially going through every single copy with small teams of researchers of the Times of India, India's newspaper of record, since the time of partition, to find every single riot event in that country. And that is the database that they built up over 46 years, from 1950, shortly after partition, to 1995. What's even more remarkable now is that you've got young scholars extending the database on an equally collaborative basis. 3 years ago, I examined a PhD at SOAS in London, where the candidate had created half of a database, updating from 1995, I believe, to 2010. So this is collaborative social science, and the database is made available to all of us. You can access this database that was created initially by Ashutosh and Stephen. It's open, and you can therefore replicate some of the experiments that they've run with the data. Now, what's remarkable about this database is that it finds very, very clear patterns, things that would not occur if the distribution of riots was random in space or in time. So if you don't know India, I would say that over the last 60 years, at any one time, on average, at least 70% of the people have lived in the countryside. At least 70% of people have lived in villages through this period. And yet 96% of all riot deaths in India have occurred in urban areas. So there's the first stark finding. If you are going to be caught up in a riot and die in a riot in India, you are almost certain to die in a town or a city. Not in the countryside, which is where people predominantly have lived and worked. It's only recently that India has started to urbanize on a massive scale in percentage terms. Secondly, 49% of all the riot deaths in India during this period, 1950 to 1995, have occurred in just 8 cities. 8 might seem a lot, but as we all know, there are a lot of very large cities in India. So the dangerous cities have been Ahmedabad in Gujarat, Aligarh, Baroda, Delhi, Hyderabad, Calcutta, Meerut, and Mumbai. Those are the 2 coordinates. And the point of this work that Varshney and Wilkinson have put together is to try and understand, well, why is it fundamentally urban? Why are some cities more dangerous than others? And why is it non-random over time? Because riot events in India have been congregated or coalescing around particularly dangerous periods, as we will see shortly. So in terms of the basic geography, the dangerous areas in India since independence have fundamentally been in the north of India and to the west. So this is a slide from Stephen Wilkinson's book, Votes and Violence, which looks at state variation in the number of Hindu-Muslim riots, in this case from 1977 to 1995. And that's the monthly average per 10 million inhabitants. Not a huge number of people. You're talking about not much more than 30 or 40,000 people, but you can see very clearly the way that they've shaded it here, that Gujarat in the west of India, which is the homeland of the current Prime Minister of the country, has been a particularly dangerous area. Places like Ahmedabad, to a lesser extent, Surat. North India more generally, particularly the states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. Generally the southern and eastern states, Orissa, West Bengal, and particularly Kerala and Tamil Nadu in the south. Far less incidents of Hindu-Muslim violence partly reflects the fact in the south that you have far fewer Muslims as a percentage in the population than in the northern states. In terms of time, and I apologize for the standard of some of these diagrams, you can see, I hope, that there was a huge outbreak of Hindu-Muslim violence at the end of the 60s and early 70s. But the reason why that a lot of social scientists paid attention to this problem is what happens at the right hand of this graph, which is really from 1985 to 1990. This is when things got very, very difficult and dangerous in India. And if you don't know India, I want to maintain now that the years between 1989 and 1992, for those of us that knew India well, that were going there on a regular basis, not to mention people that lived and worked there, these were very, very difficult times in India. The country became formally bankrupt in 1991. There was massive caste tensions around the so-called Mandal issue, or the reservation affirmative action debate in India from 1989 to 1991 particularly. And this was the time also when Hindu nationalism, in an organized sense, through what is now the ruling party in India, the Bharatiya Janata Party, became a leading force in the country. I think many people did feel in the years 1989 to 1992 that India was in danger of unraveling. As we look back now, a quarter of a century later, we see that India's been a tremendous success story in many ways, notwithstanding terrible examples of anti-women violence that are picked up with horrible regularity at the moment in the press. But certainly, at the time when these PhDs began, there was a real sense that India was on the verge of dangerous levels of tension between the two main communities, Hindu and Muslim. Now, what interests me about Schnee and Wilkinson is that having collaborated to build the same database, they write two books with radically different explanations of the same database. And I'm going to take you through both of them, a twist of our own work, and then conclude. So Ashutosh Varshney said that the fundamental difference is between towns and cities where Hindu-Muslim violence leads to destruction of property and death, and towns which remain peaceful. Wilkinson, you will see in a moment, has an explanation focused not at the town level, but at the level of state-level politics. So let me just talk you through these two models. The way that the Varshney book is constructed is that he takes three pairs of cities where we might hypothesize ex ante that you would expect, given the size of the city, the percentage of the population that is Muslim, and the caste characteristics of the city generally, should be fundamentally the same in terms of the likelihood of having Hindu-Muslim violence. But he's got three pairs of cities, you'll see shortly, where in one case it's extremely dangerous, mainly for the Muslim minority community, and others where peace breaks out rather than violence. So he finds the explanation around what he calls the density of bridging social capital. That is, associational links between the two communities at a formal level, at the level of city politics. Wilkinson, using exactly the same database, maintains, of course, that riots happen in cities, but the explanation is not to be found in the city, but in state-level politics. And he hypothesizes fundamentally that you will get riots where you've got a certain level of Muslim population and urbanization. We can take those two things for granted. But if there's likely to be an election within the next 6 months, and if the political leadership of that state has an interest in not deploying police forces to take care of potential rioters. So it's a wholly different explanation. And what I want to do is take us through the two explanations and then move to a third model. And I'll make the two explanations clearer, I hope, as we go through. Both of them, I should say, pose as general theories of riots in India, and they therefore have very different implications for public policy. Dear me. So this is the front cover of Varshini's book, Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life, Hindus and Muslims in India. He was the first one of the pair to publish his book. Wilkinson was still working on his. Fundamentally, the model is riots happen in the sense that something will kick off at particular times of the year, often around religious processions, just as the way they kick off in London or Los Angeles. There's an exogenous event, tensions in the air, rumors. However, in some cases they lead to communal violence, and in some cases to communal peace. What you can see as the intervening variable is if you have intra-communal engagement only, that is, no associations across the community divide, you have a predisposition to the same event causing violence. If you have engagement across the communities, intercommunal engagement, you are more likely to get communal peace. So in his view, you need to build associations of Hindus and Muslims in cities to guard against riots breaking out and leading to violence. Now, he looks at three pairs of cities. I'm going to take you very quickly through these pairings. One pairing is Calicut against Aligarh. The argument is that a lot of the political systems are set during the nationalist struggle in the 1920s, the development of mass politics. In Calicut, there's a prior existence of intra-Hindu caste cleavages in politics, so the Hindu community is not united. Hindu-Muslim civic links are forged, and therefore the civic structure constrains, communal polarization and violence. So if something kicks off in Calicut, there are associational logics that incline the local political leaders to deploy the police to stop violence kicking off on a more general scale. In Aligarh, in contrast, again, you've got the prior existence, but in this case of Hindu-Muslim cleavages in politics. There are no links forged between the two communities during the nationalist movements, and it becomes a powder keg. If something kicks off, we have a civic structure which promotes communal polarization and violence. He's got two other pairings I'm not going to take us through in detail. Hyderabad, again, the civic structure aggravates communal violence because of the lack of bridging capital across the two communities. In Lucknow, by contrast, in North India, you have got strong Hindu-Muslim civic links in the city. Something kicks off, but the police are deployed, and the city quietens down and it's safe. And finally, Ahmedabad, an extremely dangerous city in Gujarat, and Surat, a dangerous city, but less dangerous in the same state. In this case, it's fundamentally the fact that you have business links in Surat across the two communities, which means that the central area of the city tends to be saved during riot events, even if it breaks out in shantytowns. But when riots kick off in Ahmedabad, it tends to generalize across the city because there are no bridging associations, in Varshini's view, across the communal divide. Now, you get an entirely different explanation of the same events in Wilkinson's book, which is called Votes and Violence, Electoral Competition and Ethnic Riots in India. So the same data set, but an entirely different explanation. So in this case, there are two main independent variables, nothing to do with bridging social capital at the level of the city. The two main independent variables are, first, what he calls EPNV. Still don't know why it's not ENPP, but it is the effective number of political parties. So the argument here is that where you have states with high levels of ethnic fractionalization, if you get a large number of political parties, they compete, particularly for swing voters, and minorities are thereby empowered. Their votes count. And if your vote counts, you have a political patron who has an interest in protecting you. On the other hand, if you have a small number of political parties, and one of those parties has an interest in manipulating the communal divide, that is when things get very dangerous. So the essential proposition is the larger number of effective political parties there are, the safer it is for the minority community. Once you get down below 3 political parties, particularly coming up to an election, which is the second independent variable. If an election was within 6 months, there's a real danger that one of the political parties will manufacture riots for political advantage. So this is a very different model. So more formally, again on the left-hand side, something kicks off. This is going to happen, a precipitating event. If you have states with 3 or more effective parties at the top there, ENPV is 3.5 or higher, the government, according to this model, has an incentive to prevent riots because there are political parties to protect minority communities. When you have less than an ENPV of 3.5, 2 things could happen. If the government itself relies on minority votes, it will try and prevent riots. If it doesn't rely on minority votes, that's when it gets dangerous. Now, if this is seeming strange to you, what you need to understand is that just because a riot kicks off does not make things dangerous for people. What makes things dangerous for people is how the police behave. Things get dangerous for people if the police do not protect the minority community or actively attack the minority community. And that is fundamentally, for Wilkinson, a political decision. The politicians in this model control the police. So if a politician has an interest in protecting minorities, the police are deployed to stop a riot generalizing, a small event generalizing. Where politicians don't have that incentive, that's when things get dangerous. So here's the model. Fundamentally, the more political parties you have, the lower the number of riot events across the country from a large database going back to 1950. Oops. It's got a life of its own, this thing. Just going to read out the basic finding and then move to our own brief findings and conclude. What Wilkinson is saying is that urbanization matters. You only get riots in urban areas, and you need to have a sufficiently large Muslim population to make riots worthwhile, if I can put it in crude terms. But fundamentally, more significantly, he says, the number of Hindu-Muslim riots goes down as the effective number of parties goes up, with a coefficient for the effective number of parties significant at the 99% level across all models, including, most importantly, those regressions where I control for a state's previous level of violence, the parties in power or coalition in a state, and through the use of dummy variables for each state, other important state-level effects. He also finds that income disparities and state literacy rates have no independent effect on the outcome. The only key explanatory variable is the effective number of political parties. Now, if that's true, it's a really interesting finding, because it suggests that if you can build political competition, that is the best way to protect people against riot events. So let me move to a conclusion. As I said, as David knows, I've been a university bureaucrat now for about 9 years, so starting as a head of department before other jobs at the LSE. So it's difficult to do fieldwork these days. But I found this explanation at one level intellectually quite provocative. I know Varshney very well. I know Stephen Wilkinson less well. And it seemed to me it had immense public policy implications to know which of these two explanations was right. Do we really spend our time building associational capital at the city level, or do we try and build and deepen political parties at the state level? But I also felt, on the basis of some of the riot events that I knew myself, that things were a lot more complicated than this. So with a couple of PhD students, we just decided to run the entire experiment ourselves. But instead of taking literally thousands of riot events, from the smallest to the largest, we simply, which you shouldn't do, we selected on the dependent variable. We chose the 20 largest riot events in India since independence. And we simply tested the Wilkinson model. And unfortunately, it's not going to show up terribly well. You're going to have to take my word for this. We simply tested the Wilkinson model. We built our own database, but the database can be cross-checked against the underlying the Varshney-Wilkinson database. We chose the 20 largest events because we were not really interested in a small event where perhaps one person was killed, tragic though that would be. The 20 largest events actually generate more than 70% of all the riot deaths in the Varshney-Wilkinson database. There's over 10,000 people killed in these 20 events. And what's astonishing about it when we mapped it out is that the Wilkinson model absolutely breaks down once you choose the 20 largest events, even though the regressions work for the much larger database. So when all the riot events are not weighted equally, you get a very different finding. The Wilkinson model, we found, only really works for the anti-Sikh riots in Delhi in 1984 and for Gujarat. Now, you're going to have to take my word for this because the next slides, unfortunately, don't reproduce terribly well. But what we've got here are the 20 events. We've got the location on the left, the urban population, that is the percentage of Muslims, the reported deaths in the next column. So if we look at Jamshedpur in 1964, about 2,000 deaths is the best estimate. The effective number of political parties is the next variable. Now, that should be less than 3 if it's going to precipitate deaths in the Wilkinson model. And that's only the case in 5 of these 20 riot events. We've then got the vote share of the 2 largest party, and then on the right-hand side, we actually ask, was there an election planned within the next 6 months? In only 3 of the 20 cases was an election forthcoming in the next 20 months. It's quite a remarkable finding. So a model that is absolutely valid, we're not challenging this at the level of the entire data set, does not apparently, in our view, work for the 20 most important riot events. You've got tremendous scatter of results. You don't get that straight line coefficient for your regression, with the exception mainly of Ahmedabad 3 times and Delhi, and I'll come back to that shortly as I conclude. So these slides are basically the 20 data points, and unfortunately I've been a bit ill at the weekend, you can tell from my voice, and we've only been able to do these slides at short notice, but this is from a published paper. Anybody that wants to see it can access the data there quite easily. Let me just conclude by saying why we think this is, and this is really where you have to read a paper more anthropologically, because when you're trying to explain difference, you really need to go into prose and have a very different approach, I think, in terms of analysis. But we tried to group the explanation into 2 or 3 key areas, if I can get this thing finally to work. So rather grandly, we said the first set of issues had to do with timing, consistencies, heterogeneous incentive regimes and principal-agent problems. So we've taken a couple of examples here of the 20 worst riot events. One was in a town called Bihar Sharif in 1981. In fact, the BJP was not very well organized in Bihar Sharif in 1981. The RSS, which is the underlying Hindu nationalist organization, was active there. But the elections were some way off, and the BJP's rise was far more obvious by 1984 than by 1981. And in any case, it wasn't a state-level effect at all. This was the general rise, I think, of the BJP in the mid-1980s. More interesting, and I'll spend more time on it, was the riot in Ahmedabad in 1985. This was initially upper caste Hindus mobilizing against reservations, including reservations for Muslims, but not just for Muslims, for some members of what are called the other backward castes as well. Now, according to Wilkinson's model, the ruling Congress at that time in Gujarat should have intervened to stop the rioting when it started. But it didn't. And the reasons were, first of all, that the party didn't hold together. So there were heterogeneous incentive regimes, one part of the Congress party allied with the BJP. And secondly, government employees were on strike. So the capacity of the principal to control the agent, the government to control the police force, simply broke down on that occasion, and the police themselves, essentially, to use the phrase, ran riot. More interesting is a case study that one of the authors, Tatsumi, did for her PhD as Meerut in UP. Those of you that know India will know that Meerut, about 150 miles northeast of Delhi, is historically an extremely dangerous city in India. It was very dangerous in the late 1980s. And yet when riots broke out at the time of a big wave of Hindu nationalism in 1992, Meerut remained safe. And it's a very interesting case study. And Kayoko's PhD fundamentally showed the way that the Muslim community exercised its own political agency between 1987, the time of the last riot there, and 1992, that they actively built a new identity for themselves in the city as, quote, Indian Muslims, and built a political alliance with other communities that might have been at the wrong end of certain forms of organized Hindu violence. That is not taken account of in the Wilkinson model. Arguably, it is alluded to in Varshni's model. It is a form of associational bridging social capital. But this is a classic example of how minority communities in an extremely dangerous city didn't wait for an expansion in the effective number of political parties, but took charge of their own destiny. And remarkably, at a time when other cities all around it were breaking out in riots in 1992, Meerut remained safe. Now, the worst example recently of Hindu-Muslim violence in India, you will know, was not that long ago, in 2002, in Ahmedabad, in Gujarat. And this still hangs over some members of the ruling political elite in India today. Many people have described it as an anti-Muslim pogrom at that time. Gujarat does bear out the Wilkinson model. You fundamentally had two parties competing for power, the Congress and the BJP. An election was coming up, and it was to the advantage of one political party, at least according to this model, either to foment political tensions or to make sure that when tensions broke out, they were not properly policed. There's no doubt that the Wilkinson model holds true there, but equally, the inflections of Hindu nationalism in Gujarat quite subtly different to other parts of India, in my view. There's been a much stronger ideology of revanchist Hinduism or Hindutva in Gujarat than, for example, in many parts of eastern India. There's a lot of hard ideological work, in other words, that's gone into the production of Gujarat as a site of political violence. Sorry. So let me conclude. When you get to the end of Wilkinson's book, it's a beautiful book. It's a paragon in many ways of social science. It addresses a serious problem, it collects a database, it makes the database available to all of us, it builds a model, and it's predictive. And he ends the book by saying, I think very generously, ultimately the best long-run tests of an explanation is whether it seems to work with new data or to be successful at predicting what will happen in new situations. Well, that's the challenge we took up. Unfortunately, in our view, for the Wilkinson model, in only 3 out of 20 cases is the variable proximity to state and national elections confirmed, and only in 5 out of 20 cases is the variable ENPV, the effective number of political parties, confirmed. 3 of those 5 occasions are in the same city, Ahmedabad, and the other one, very obviously, was Delhi at the time of the anti-Sikh riots, the revenge on the Sikh community in Delhi following the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984. That actually suggests that those are exceptions to the rule. Otherwise, the error terms override. The regression line is actually concealing, in my view, a tremendous level of heterogeneity in India. This is unsettling, I'm afraid, at the end of the day, because it means that it's unlikely that we will be able to deal with the phenomenon of Hindu-Muslim violence and riots in India on the basis of one single intuition about either building associational capital or increasing the effective number of political parties. But I wanted to end on a slightly different note. I don't think, having said all this, that we are suckers to search for patterns. But I do think that as we build social science at this university, which we will do, I hope we will be sufficiently open-minded to recognize that we don't need a one-size-fits-all model of social science. I don't embrace a passion for difference in the same way that Henrietta Moore does. I don't generally think that n equals 1 is the most productive way of thinking as a social scientist. But I do think that as we begin to be better trained as social scientists, we also need to be attentive to questions of identity formation, meaning and understanding, Verstehen, in the German account, which are not easily captured in these more statistical models of human behavior. So I would hope that we will have strong social scientific training in the university for our undergraduates, our postgraduates, our faculty, but in both domains. So that's not a passion for difference in Moore's sense, a passion for particularity. It's a passion for difference at the level of the 2 or the 3 cultures and a respect for different ways of going about social science. I have a huge amount of respect for economists that I've worked with. I'm sure David feels the same. I'm not of the view, though, that economics is the new physics. I think that's a misleading way to think about social science. I think if there are models for social science in the sciences, they're far more likely to be found in something like biology than in physics. But we can learn just as much, I think, from anthropology and from history. So I think the search for order is well-intentioned, but I don't think that we should expect order necessarily to be the order of the day in the world that we observe. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stuart. I mean, I did think you were just becoming a bureaucrat, but actually this lecture shows very clearly that you are thinking very seriously, not just about the subject that has engaged you so long, India, but about the very nature of the social sciences with, of course, immediate policy impact, which is about how to develop the social sciences at Durham University. I very much agree with the main thrust of your conclusion. There clearly cannot be a single model for the social sciences, and it clearly can't just be quantitative, because quantitative doesn't reach into the depth and complexity of culture. Yeah. And whilst you have great complexities of culture, you have clashes in the fundamental meaning of identity and of every symbolic aspect of life. But before I ask you questions, I mean, we should get the audience to ask you questions, and I'm sure there are some who will want to ask about India, and perhaps others who want to ask about the social sciences.
Can I just ask if somebody can lend me a pen?
Yes, I can lend you a pen.
Thanks, Dave.
So we've got a mic over there, and we could just have hands up. Are you okay to take 2 or 3 questions at a time?
It'd be really nice to get a name.
Yes, names and maybe what subject you work in and your question.
Hi, Rory McInnes-Gibbons. I'm a classics undergraduate here at Durham. Something you touched upon, albeit very briefly, was the spate of violence against women, rape, etc. Sorry, that's an awful expression. I just wanted to know your opinion on that, whether you think obviously it's a wider societal issue, but whether it has its remedies within the policing or it's more of a political problem within India. Thank you.
In short, how much of what you said applies to this huge axis of violence as well? Yes, over there. Someone had their hand up. Yeah.
Hi, Cameron Dean, Physics. I was just wondering where you thought the main kind of drive for the quantification of the social sciences comes from. I know that a great deal of it comes from funding. Everything in so many fields is going towards something that some number you can give, some graph you can show that's more concrete somehow inherently than kind of a more descriptive narrative. Whether that's helpful, whether that's actually kind of beneficial as a side effect, and what the kind of whether that's a good enough motive for a social scientist working in that kind of area, and whether they kind of are being forced to do that because of the funding, or whether they want to do that because it's very applicable, as you say, in political terms and all the rest of it.
And there's just one question at the front, and then we'll have a second round in a minute, yeah?
Hi, I'm Eva Maria Nag, School of Government. Thanks, Stuart, that was great. This is a question again about the social sciences and about the alpha and omega of what you were saying. Can I just pick up on some trends in international relations theory, and I'd like your views on those. One is a slight resistance I can see to the obsession with looking at social science as a problem-oriented science. I mean, does it really always have to be about problems? And the other is the end bit, which is policy orientation. And again, I think there's a lot in IR theory now that tells us that maybe taking steps backwards and thinking about issues before acting may be the way forward, especially in the context of R2P, which has really been sort of, quite a sort of testing ground for where things can go terribly wrong if you just start applying your theories to the policy world. And just your thoughts on that. Thank you.
We'll just stick with 3, yeah?
So thank you all very much. It's interesting. I think the databases on violence against women in India are much less well developed than the database around Hindu-Muslim violence, but there are a number of people, Bina Agarwal is one amongst them, that are beginning to build up a very serious database about anti-women violence over time. And the scale of it is stunning and quite shocking. As you might know, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago when I was speaking at Ushur, that my great hero in social science, in terms of living social scientists, is Amartya Sen. And Sen wrote a very famous article in the New York Review of Books, must be 15, 20 years ago, saying that there are 100 million missing women in the world today. So that is to say that, you would expect biologically about 1,003 women for every 1,000 men. And if you add up the total number of men and women in the world, you would find that there are about 100 million missing women. And those women are fundamentally missing in China, and then in South Asia, particularly in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. So that gives you some sense of the scale of the issue. In India alone, we're probably talking about 35 million missing women. Further evidence of that is that there are many parts of northwest India, which is part of an answer to your question, where the sex ratio today is something like 1,400 men for every 1,000 females. I mean, that gives you some sense of really, a genocide, essentially, against women over a long period of time. There's very little evidence that things are actually improving. If you look at the all India sex ratio, it's somewhere around 970, I think, for 1,000. But you do find, nonetheless, in India, that the patterns are not random. So the violence very much mirrors the violence that you saw in the slide that I put up. There are certain states in India where women are missing much more than others, and it tends to be northwest India, states like Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, to a certain extent Gujarat as well. It's not fundamentally the southern states. So there is a fundamental divide in India between the 4 Dravidian states in the south and the northern states. Now, there's been a lot of work on what is going on here. Is this fundamentally a result of the fact that Brahminical Hinduism is much more established in North India as compared to the south? Is it the fact that fundamentally in the south you've had a rice ecosystem which has been far more dependent on female labour, which means that women are more valued in that ecosystem than in a wheat ecosystem, a plough agriculture system in northern India? But I do think you can begin to look at that question about anti-women violence through that macro lens. I mean, it's rooted in very deeply rooted systems of misogyny and of sexism. But it's not constant across India, and there are, of course, very strong movements challenging this, fortunately, in the country. But I don't think, as a direct answer to your question, that we have the same sort of database on this yet. I think it will be a project for a number of people, scholars and activists, that we have for the Hindu-Muslim violence. Quantification is a really interesting question, and I think one of the people that's written on this is Philip Morawski, who you might know, who's written a history of why it is that economics particularly had the quantitative turn. And the argument is fundamentally it was the strong role of the Rand Corporation, military needs in the United States, and as you said, funding opportunities on the one hand. Secondly, of course, and this was very much the case in a subject like geography, that subjects have to establish themselves in the academy more generally. Geography is a good example here. You do not get geography in Ivy League universities. Harvard closed down geography from memory in 1948. He took the opportunity of closing down the department on the basis that the department head at the time was gay, a guy called Derwent Whittlesey. I'd have to check my facts, but I think this is correct. And geography is only really done at elite American universities, at places like Berkeley and UCLA. But it was partly the fact that geography was not considered to be a reputable subject. And it was fundamentally, how high is a mountain, how long is a river, that sort of thing. The quantitative turn in geography, about which I do know a fair amount in the 1960s, was really an attempt to defend geography against that charge, that it was fundamentally descriptive and not intellectual. So there was a spate of model building in geography in the 1960s. So you can have models, predicting, which is useful for train operators, that more people, surprisingly, go between Birmingham and London every day than between Durham and London every day. It's, fundamentally a gravity model looking at population flows relative to density. So in the case of geography, I think it was a protective mechanism to give it some kind of stability in the academy at a time when it was under threat. In economics more recently, it seems to me that, and I say this with some trepidation because I've enjoyed going to economics seminars. They're of a remarkably high standard, certainly the institution that we've both come from, and I'm sure that's the case here. But for a discipline that is based fundamentally on the idea of competition, it is remarkable that at an institution like the LSE, every economist is expected to publish in the same 6 journals. So there's been essentially a movement towards a single methodological approach in economics, and I think that's also driven the rise of quantification. But linked to that, of course, the fact is that, who hires people? Whether it's banks, the World Bank, the UN, economists are more in demand than anthropologists. And I think the reason for that is that some of their arguments hold at a wider spatial canvas. Governments need to scale interventions, so you would make use of randomized experiments of the type that I showed you by the MIT Poverty Action Lab, and I think that's the difficulty for social sciences like anthropology that are based on N=1. And I agree with David. I mean, you need to understand motives, you need to understand identity and identity construction, but it probably doesn't have as much to say to a public policy audience the quantitative skills that are now mainstream elsewhere. IR theory, you know the answer far better than I, and I think we're seeing the same sorts of struggles in IR now that we've seen in political science. Again, it seems to me that you would want to know something about who controls the journals, who are the gatekeepers, how are they defining the issues. But I think it probably touches on the second answer that I gave, and maybe it's time for me to stop there and we can have a sort of bilateral afterwards.
Thank you. Additional questions? Yes, we've got plenty of time. We've got three here, just on the left side alone. Let's start at the front, and then just with this lady here, and then we'll go back to Rose for 2 questions.
Thank you. It's Yulia Yegorova from Anthropology Department. Yeah, thank you very much for the paper. I found it really absolutely fascinating. And I wonder if anybody has tried to use these models, this research, both yours and the models that you've presented, in studying rights in other parts of the world, both in kind of a sociological or historical studies. I'm thinking particularly here about research on anti-Jewish pogroms in the Russian Empire, and models of saying, well, is it more about local relations on the ground, or is it about the actions of the Tsarist government and the police?
Great question, yeah. And there are 2 people just there, 2 rows back.
Hello, thank you. My name is Steve Lyon, also from Anthropology. It's a fascinating paper. I work in Pakistan and have looked across the border with some horror at these attacks on both sides. But one of the things that I find quite distressing about all of these models that you presented, and I've read some of this stuff, is that they're very closed. So in Pakistan, you can't understand the rise in sectarian violence without bringing the outside forces. It is not just sort of local state parties or local bridging associations, but there are real forces outside that are stimulating some of these things. So I wonder if you could just comment on what outside forces might need to be brought in to make these slightly more realistic.
Hello, I'm Rafaela Cormer from Schnee, doing research on India-Pakistan relations. My question is related to one of the graphs you presented, and it showed that there was an outburst of violence, I think, in the 70s, and then there was an increase in riots. And I was wondering whether this trajectory is continuing nowadays. As one question, as the second question, what the reasons are, or how you would explain the increase in riots nowadays.
Could I add one question about the social sciences? We're going to have another round in just a second. And it's about, I want to pick up the question about policy and policy recommendations. I'm very much with Hegel in that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings with the coming of dusk. The wisdom comes when you look back in time, and the social sciences in general are poor predictive disciplines. And they're poor predictive disciplines for a very good reason. That is, empirical quantitative model testing only works on a limited number of variables. But the world outside that model works on an intersecting set of variables, the weight of which constantly changes as a result of external and internal factors. As a result of that, we are always surprised in the social sciences. There's one model, there's 2 models, and there's a third potential one that compromises. And in a way, that's good, because science always progresses by pointing out the limits of what has come before. But in the case of the social sciences, we're caught in a really fundamental dilemma, because physics and other natural sciences engage with a world that doesn't interpret itself. We engage in a world that does interpret itself. So what we contribute also changes the conditions of our models, as the history of political ideas and so on over the centuries clearly shows. And this brings me to a final reflection. I'm very struck how you use the distinction of a Claren and Verstehen to capture the difference between, let's say, model testing and understanding. culture and its complexity. And in a way, this distinction has been with us, you know, through the whole of the 20th century, in one form or another. Max Weber gives it its earliest, in a sense, most systematic statement. Habermas later tries to make it three models, Erklärung, Verstehen, and Critique, but the third one tends to collapse into the second and ends up with these two positions. I wonder, isn't there a case, given that the social sciences depend on these two methods, and I'd like to hear what you think of this, to say that the social sciences should no longer be disciplinary based, if we accept what we have both said, but rather problem based and problem focused, and draw on the methods required in this limited set to understand these problems. And that may mean, in due course, we move away from disciplines towards a much greater level of interdisciplinarity, informed by rigorous methodologies of both kinds, but actually attentive to the fact that the best we can hope to ever grasp of is a limited range of these intersecting problems. That's all. Thank you.
Great questions, not easy questions. The first one, yes, I mean, I think that it's interesting, actually, the final chapter in Wilkinson's book is an attempt to generalize, and from memory, I think it takes in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Northern Ireland, interestingly. But of course, you've got people like Fearon and Leighton writing about these issues more generally in Africa. So I think, you know, the general model of looking at political competition and the production of ethnic violence is quite widely established. I mean, for me, linking perhaps to the second question, I think also anthropologists have explored it, as I understand it, in a slightly different way. So if you look at the South Asian literature, particularly look at the work of Thomas Blom Hansen, then the idea that violence is pleasurable is actually investigated by Hansen. That's a very, very difficult concept, I think, for social scientists to get their heads around. But when you look at the behavior of some of the, the Shiv Sena thugs in Mumbai and some of the accounts, they're actually probably dealt with better by novelists like, Maximum City, but also the accounts of football hooligans in this country, many of whom were middle class. There's the pleasure of violence, I think, surfaces in some of the more anthropological understandings and literary understandings of even Hindu-Muslim violence in a way that doesn't come through in some of these more generalized social science models. But I mean, the basic answer is yes. At the end of his book, he does generalize out from South Asia. Pakistan and India, this is really interesting to me because it picks up David's question. I mean, clearly, these very exciting moments in social science are predicated on the idea of closure. And these puzzles tend to be phrased mainly at a micro or at best a mesoscale. The mesoscale mainly through the randomized experiments. And what they're inattentive to are, I think, the construction of ideologies and identities at a much more generalized spatial scale. So in the case of Africa, I would think of something like the work of Mahmoud Mamdani, particularly around citizens and subjects, looking at very long-standing colonial path dependencies, creating the construction of a tribe, in the same way that there have been lots of people working in India, Partha Chatterjee, Nick Dirks and others, around the ethnographic state idea, which is that fundamentally the identities that are mobilized politically nowadays are often they have tremendous path dependencies going back to particular forms of rule that were put in play, as you know, by the British imperial state. And all of that is sort of, it's not that Wilkinson, of course, is unaware of it. He's an incredibly smart guy, so is Ashu. But they're not foregrounded, not privileged in these accounts, because the attempt is to narrow down the lens, to sharpen, I think, the point of attack in terms of building a more formal model. And I think this is what David is talking about too. And this is a difficult dialectic, of course, within social science. The third question, I've got very poor notes on this, but it's the question, I think, of the periodicity of it. Well, this is very interesting to me, and I think one thing that's missing for me, both from Wilkinson, probably less so from Varshni, is the hard ideological work that went into the construction of the Hindutva project. So for those of you that don't know India, the BJP, which is now the dominant party in India, morphed out of a previous Hindu nationalist party that rarely got more than about 7% of the vote before 1980. So the 1980s was really a period in which Hindu nationalism was constructed as a vibrant political force in India. You'd always had the voluntary organizations before. Obviously the RSS were active in India, it still is active, but the mobilization of a more concrete identity for Hindu nationalism was very much a project, I think, of the 1980s. It was quite brilliantly manufactured with a tremendous mythology and iconography. I've written about this in the context of the production of the bomb in India in 1998. The idea that India is a sacred mythological land going from the Indus, which of course is modern Pakistan, to the seas Bangladesh, from Mount Kailash, which would be the abode of Lord Shiva, right down to Kanyakumari. So there is a mythologized account that India is sacred to the Hindus and that everybody else is fundamentally an alien invader. And that was a lot of ideological work that I think went into the 1980s. When you put that together with the rise of tremendous caste tensions around the reservations debate, the so-called Mandalization of politics in India, the ending of majority rule, which was really, with the assassination of not Indira Gandhi but Rajiv Gandhi at the end of the 1980s and the bankruptcy of the country, then I think all of these things came together. There was also links to circuits into Pakistan of Islamic violence as well, with the bombs that went off, you might remember, in 1992 in Mumbai. I was flying in to Delhi on a regular basis at that time, and it did feel as though India was becoming a very dangerous place. So you do get that peak in violence at the end of the 1990s. Now, interestingly, since the terrible events in Gujarat in 2002, the incidence of large-scale riot events in India has gone down. And arguably that is consistent with some version of the democracy deepening thesis. It's also because once the BJP got into power, it behaved differently than it did as an opposition party. That is the sort of the movement to the centre that you generally get in democratic political systems. So there have been some recent riot events you might have picked up in India, but it's not as dangerous as it was at the time when this body of work was really precipitated. David's put into play what I assume is one of our joint great heroes. I mean, for me, one of them would be Maynard Keynes, another would be Max Weber. His younger brother, Alfred, was a famous geographer, but not quite as famous as the Großer Max, as I believe he called his older brother. And I entirely take David's point that we are faced with this difficult situation, I think, in social science of deciding whether to close the lens, in which case you can hold things constant and approach a closed system, or accept the fact that that is just not how human systems are. They are fundamentally open systems. It's extremely difficult to isolate the independent variable. And we have to have that dual tacking backwards and forwards. This came to a fore, David knows, I just might mention it once, at the LSE when we decided to invent a core course. I was given responsibility for this and rather unwisely took it to the academic board, and we called it Thinking Like a Social Scientist. And it was going to be a core course for all of the first years, you might remember, David. And the idea was that nobody should leave LSE without being exposed to some big public policy lectures which would end in a question mark. Has the Cold War really ended? What should be the price of a ton of carbon? Stuff like that. And then you would have, I think we budgeted 83 separate tutorial groups each week, where you would try and work with the students on how would you answer these big questions. And the basic intuition was no anthropologist should leave LSE without understanding why we do regression analysis, even if they didn't know how to do regression analysis. And no economist should leave LSE without having heard of Max Weber, Karl Marx, or Michel Foucault. All that seemed very wise, but when we took it to the academic board, I called it Thinking Like a Social Scientist, without recognizing that LSE had a big department of maths, statistics, and history. And they all hated the title. So they all came out to vote it down. So we took it back, called it LSE 100, and it went through. So the rationality of academics. But that was an attempt to address this fundamental issue. How do we train our students? What do we think they shouldn't graduate without? And I think it's an issue at any serious university. How do we train our undergraduates? How do you design an IR curriculum nowadays, an economics curriculum, sociology curriculum, or a political science curriculum? And David's right, that was the subtext of the talk, really. I think they're difficult issues. My own view, of course, is a middle-of-the-road view that I do think all of our students should be quantitatively trained and qualitatively trained.
More questions? Are you okay to take a few more? It's getting, I know you've had a long weekend and a long week. So let's just take maybe 3 or 4 more final questions, yeah? We'll take a final cluster, yeah? Yes, there's several here.
Hannah, doing Arabic and politics. I was wondering whether there was a way in which ethno-religious violence in India, just because I don't actually know that much about it, intersects with anti-women violence, sort of in the way that I assume more extremely it did in Bosnia with the sort of mass rape of Bosniak women.
Very good question.
Yeah. There's a whole cluster here, yeah.
I congratulate you for a lucid talk, informative talk. Thanks for giving me information. I'll take back home some information from you. One observation in a map of India, in Punjab and West Bengal, these are the areas where least conflicts have been seen. And unfortunately, these are the states from where the country has been carved, Pakistan has been carved for both the countries. So I'll be interested that what's the reason that in these 2 states conflicts are less? Is it an interfaith between the religions and the communities or something else? Second part of the question, that these 2 theories, I will call it as a theory of these 2 authors, applies to the rural level also, because this is a city's data. And last part, how we compare these conflicts pre-partition and post-partition. Thank you.
Yes, there was someone else.
It's very my name is Padunta Basu from Economics and Finance. Really enjoyed your talk. Very quick question, that you mentioned something about this intercommunal communication that sort of reduces this kind of ethnic conflict. So and you probably, I did not cover much about this role of education, literacy, human capital. So this communication could be very much connected to literacy education, because one example is Kerala, right? Yes. 100% literacy, and there is not much evidence of ethnic violence. I'm not a specialist in it, but I've not heard anything about that in the southern states or things like that. So just if you can comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else who really, yeah, someone was a big, bold hand. Stuart, let's pick up I think this will be the last question unless anyone wants to put their hand up now.
Okay. Jonathan Miles Watson, Theology and Religion. And listening to you talk about social science and its role and its interlocutors with physics and the like, I was wondering about the sort of debates that are going on, certainly in my department a lot, about what anthropology can take from things like theology and from art, the more sort of creative and evocative disciplines that we might have. So the role of social science, I guess I'm asking, not as something that prescribes or even just describes, but that inspires and evokes, whether you see a sort of future for it in that direction. Thank you.
And finally, someone had their hand up here. Yeah, last question.
Hi, this is Anurag Banerjee from Economics. I was just, I have no very broad question, but I was thinking about the data you had about the database of Varshney. That there is a huge spike after 91, but also historically in 1991 they liberalized the media. So the number of media channel actually went up. So it can be simply a denominator effect. Sorry, thank you.
I'll end on that one. It's a really interesting observation. I'll try and be brief. I mean, a lot of these questions, I think very interestingly for me, centered on partition. So in terms of ethno-religious violence and violence against women, a lot of the information that we have come from partition stories. And those of you that know India will know that this was largely silenced for maybe 50 years after partition, probably in the same way that people that fought in Vietnam didn't want to speak about it, or World War II. But a large number of stories did come out about what happened around partition. There's no doubt that women were targeted at that time. So there was violence against women as a proxy for violence between the communities. So I think undoubtedly there are links between ethno-religious violence and violence against women, and we know that from stories around that time and at other times. In the more recent events, like in Gujarat too, in 2002, there's also some evidence of targeting of females in the minority community by some of the attackers, but I don't know enough about that literature to know how extensive that was. Going back to the partition, partition, of course, hangs over South Asian politics, whether it's in Bangladesh now, Pakistan, or India. And it's something that's constantly worked through in the political imaginaries of all three countries, I would say, on a daily basis. And it informs the hard ideological work in India, particularly of the Hindu nationalist parties, because Pakistan is considered to be fundamentally a part of India that was lost or given away. So it is part of the greater Indian imaginary of the Hindu nationalist movement. So I think it's undeniably and ineluctably linked to the production of riot events, but perhaps not in a direct way. The question of rurality and why I didn't mention it is that the database shows very clearly that notwithstanding the fact that through this period about 3/4 of all Indians lived in the countryside has remained fundamentally safe. There are very few riot deaths in the countryside. There are individual events, there are individual stabbings, murders, and so on and so forth. But it's very clear, and this is the starting point for both books, that the countryside has remained fundamentally safe. That was not true, of course, at the time of partition, whether you're talking about Punjab or Bengal. It certainly wasn't true of the Great Bengal Famine either in 43, 44. But the countryside has remained fundamentally safe. So both models assume that riots presuppose the existence of an urban environment. And this tends to be true of the worldwide literature, going back to the other question about whether you can generalize it out of India and South Asia. Education, literacy, and human capital. Well, the interesting thing in the model is that when you run the regressions in Wilkinson's model, they're all controlled for, and none of them appears to have a statistically significant effect. So there seems to be no statistically significant relationship to literacy levels, no statistically significant relationships to inequality levels, or to human capital more generally. In the Varshni model, it's slightly different because human capital surfaces in the form of associational or bridging social capital. But generally, in Wilkinson's model, it's not constituted as a significant variable at all. It comes down fundamentally to urbanization, effective number of political parties, and the amount of time before an election. And interestingly, his model does work for the full plot that he's got. I just don't think it works for the 20 largest riot events. So there's an interesting statistical phenomenon going on here when you've got large dispersed data sets and a more centralized, if I might put it that way, data set. And on the last point, I would hope yes. I mean, I do think, I don't know enough about your subject, although I had a very interesting visit to theology last week. It's particularly strong, obviously, at Durham. But the lecture that I'd like to give next term is something that I say in graduation speeches and at congregation. It seems to me that we want to make the lives of our undergraduates difficult. And so I pause, for effect, whilst they take it in. But then I say, in the best way. I mean, Max Weber, I think, once said, the true function of social science is to render problematic that which is conventionally self-evident, which presumably is more elegant in the German. And I remember hearing this as an 18-year-old thinking, crikey, I'm not sure I'm in the right place. I don't know what this means. But we really should think that every time we draw money out of an ATM machine, what is going on here? How can a piece of plastic produce paper that is expressive of a value relationship that constitutes human identity. There's something strange and wonderful going on. We have to assume that these things work. It's not that in God we trust on an American banknote, we trust the Fed. But a sense of wonder and awe seems to me to be an important part of public life, even though we have to deal with the everyday. We can't assume that an ATM is a strange beast, but in one sense, what an ATM symbolizes, I think, is, and it does seem to me, and perhaps I haven't quite caught your question, that a really important part of social science or of a university experience more generally is to say to somebody coming in, have you thought about this? I always try and give the story at graduation or congregation of Einstein. I mean, Einstein reportedly said he was only interested in one thing, being proved wrong. And if that's done through inspiration or just challenging your fundamental assumptions, that's the great joy, I think, of being at university. Of course, we have to make people employable. We have a duty of care to our students, but I think challenging students intellectually at the end of the day in a university like this is our fundamental, our first order duty. And if that's done through inspiration, no better way.
Let me just perhaps draw this to an end by saying the following. We all welcome you here, Stuart, as a Vice-Chancellor, but I can see more clearly this evening that it comes as a slight price, that we also lose you, or rather this is a warning, we don't want to lose you as a teacher, because the lecture this evening was both elegant and extraordinarily clear, and presented the dilemmas and some of the critical issues of social science in a way that was just astonishingly clear. So let's keep you as a Vice-Chancellor, but keep these opportunities common so that we still benefit from you as a teacher. So on that note, I just want to thank you very much for a great evening.